power, under a separation of power, you have separate institutions, separate people, separate groups performing the separate functions of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. And in our system, Congress is the legislative branch, and I think that's our primary focus today. The president heads up the executive branch, and the courts make up the judicial branch in our system. In addition to this separation of powers, we also have an intricate system of checks and balances as well. So all that's kind of important, I think, to keep in context as we talk about each institution. It really doesn't work in isolation of the others. It's an intricate system based upon the idea of a balanced government, where no one institution or no one particular group, or certainly no one person, the complete power of government at their disposal. I guess to make a contemporary joke out of that, as I like to tell my classes, it would be like giving whiskey and car keys to a teenage boy. You don't want to concentrate too much power into the hands of the one or the few, and our system is set up to try to protect against that. I don't know if anybody else wants to launch in at this point and start talking about Congress, or if we need to hash over a little bit more the importance or the reasoning behind separation of powers or checks and balances.
Interestingly enough, on the separation of powers, of course, just to reinforce some of the things that you were saying is the insurance policy to the checks and balances that there won't be a concentration of power is, of course, federalism, where you have the states are also have power within the system as well. And so that's one of the reasons why all of the states are running a separate election. And that's the way that the Founding Fathers had envisioned it, that we don't necessarily have the executive branch or the legislative branch running the election. And what I try to encourage among my students is just to, when you study this and you see what their aim was and you see the way that they set it up, there's a genius to it. There really is a genius to it. There's a reason why the United States has been so stable and has been the longest standing sort of constitutional government outside of Iceland and Switzerland, but they don't count because they're too small. So that's what I wanted to say.
You know,
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just real quickly, just kind of building on that. I mean, I agree with you, both of you, and I think that the idea of diffused power throughout the system is something that you always have to be mindful of, and you even see it within states. There's some areas within states where cities have power. They can operate kind of independent of what the governor tells them, things along those lines.
Yeah, one of the ways I like to explain it in class is, if you want to think about it, and really, I agree with you. It's an ingenious system, but if you look at the Constitution, I mean, most of the Constitution is an attempt to diffuse power, and through that separation of powers and checks and balances that exists at the federal level, it's a horizontal dispersion of power. And then, Ted, as you rightfully noted, when you combine that with our federalist structure where power is divided between the federal government and the states, you've got a further dispersal of power vertically. And it was certainly, one of their primary goals is to make sure power was dispersed, which is interesting in and of itself, because throughout history there's kind of been this debate: is it better to create a system where there'll be unanimity of power and things can efficiently get done, or is it better to disperse power, ostensibly in the name of liberty and protection of the individual from tyranny? And right or wrong, we erred on the side of the latter.
Which accounts for a lot of the frustration that people have with our government. And it's interesting when the students complain about government not getting things done, I take a different viewpoint. I
do too.
In such a diverse country of 330 million people, you don't necessarily want to be totally and completely efficient, because the people that are in power currently will impose their will on 45% of the American people that don't necessarily agree with that. And so we generally don't allow that. There's been a few presidents that have had more power than others. Obviously, FDR is sort of representative of what you talked about when you talk about unanimity. LBJ got close to that level of power. But for the most part, it's been a system in which the president has had to sort of negotiate with the other branches of the government. And so that's the way it should be. But then again, I'm an American. I'm not a Frenchman or a Brit.
Right.
I would say, you know, it's the way the system's set up. It's better to have something happen slowly or not at all than to happen quickly, because you have to be comfortable in something that you don't want, or how do I say this? You have to be comfortable in that, in the sense that, like, otherwise something you don't want could come to pass when a party or a person is in power that you disagree with. So when you're, you know, I always tell students, you know, when you're frustrated about something you want to get done, not getting passed to the Congress or signed by the president, whatever it might be, just be grateful the next time something that you don't want passed gets blocked, right? And that's the advantage of it.
I agree. And I've always, kind of stressed too that, in a system like ours where you have this dispersal of power, to do anything really big, you're going to have to build a national coalition of sorts. You're going to have to, everybody's going to have to come to as close as we can get to a reasonable agreement that this is a good idea. And I don't think that's a bad thing. You got to do the heavy lifting of convincing the public that this is a good idea, if you're going to push something through really big anyway, through this, separated system. And I think that's better than it is worse.
I agree.
So, Professor Powers, on your chalkboard behind you, I see that you have Congress broken down into two different branches, the House of Representatives and Senate. Could you explain that a little bit more in detail about that breakdown and how those two branches represent Congress and what Congress' role, not to say power is, but what their role is?
Okay. Well, again, first things first, Congress was given all legislative authority under Article 1. Actually, a lot of interesting things about Congress. The ordering of these institutions in the Constitution is significant, certainly symbolic. I think the founding fathers intended for Congress to be the first among equals, not necessarily, the dominant branch, but if there were to be one branch more powerful than the others, I think they clearly intended for it to be Congress, because its members are closer to the people. They're democratically elected members of the judiciary, and the president is indirectly elected through the Electoral College. Anyway, Congress is broken into two branches, and I don't know how deeply we will go into that, but that's based upon the great compromise reached at the Constitutional Convention. But in a sense, what you have in Congress is a mini separation of powers and checks and balances going on. You first have power separated between Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary, and then you open the door to Congress. You've got a further separation of powers between the House of Representatives and the Senate, which, though they're both institutions of Congress, they're very different animals. House members are elected from districts to represent districts within states in the U.S. Congress. Senators are represented from statewide elections to represent entire states in Congress. So the way they represent us is different. And the House is established to give preference to larger states. Representation in the House is based on population, what we call proportional representation. So California currently has 53 of the 435 members of the House, and Montana has one seat in the U.S. House. It's because California is far more populated. So in the House of Representatives, states with larger populations, based on the theory, they have more people to represent. Their people will pay more in taxes, get more seats, and therefore more power in the House of Representatives. But in the Senate, every state is represented equally. And this is to protect the interests of smaller states from being taken advantage of by the larger states that wield more power in the House. And I'll close with this. Congress is, again, the legislative branch, and they're responsible for making law. But for a bill to become law, both the House and the Senate must approve that bill in identical form. So the House alone, representing the interest of larger states, cannot force a bill that the smaller states would disagree with. And the Senate alone, where if you think about it, the smaller states have disproportionate power, can't pass a bill into law that the larger states might find objectionable. So we again see within Congress this kind of mini attempt at a separation of powers, of checks and balances, a balanced system where, you know, at least in this case, geographically, as many interests as possible are represented.
So although it's not written into the Constitution that we're going to have a party system, Congress can ultimately create their own structure. And they do that by majority. And so, and majorities are established in Congress traditionally by parties. And so the House of Representatives has a majority Democratic Party. I believe it's 232 to 187. And so they elect a leader of the House of Representatives, and that is Nancy Pelosi, is the Speaker of the House. And the House of Representatives has 435 members. And of course, it's by population. And so not all of those members are as powerful as other members. Generally speaking, the longer you are in the House of Representatives, the more power you're going to have within your party caucus, which is where the parties will meet within Congress, both in the House and the Senate. And within that party caucus, they will ultimately decide who the leaders are going to be. And in the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House is extremely powerful and operates somewhat like a dictator of the House. Whereas in the Senate, which is made up of only 100 people and that is controlled by the Republican Party, 53 to 47, they have a leader, and Mitch McConnell, but Mitch McConnell has less control over his majority. The thing about Mitch McConnell is he's an expert politician. He's very good at what he does, and he's been at it for a long period of time. I mean, Nancy Pelosi is also good, but when I say that the majority leader in the Senate is less powerful than the Speaker of the House, that's normally true, but Mitch McConnell has an inordinate amount of power, but that's a separate issue altogether. But each and every senator, it is a little bit more equal than they are in the House. And the senators, of course, as we know, they serve for a 6-year term, which means that they're relatively safe after the election and they can make decisions independently from their party. Whereas the House of Representatives, they serve for 2 years. And here's where you get into the genius of the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers didn't want to have overwhelming change every single election. And so all of the members of the House of Representatives are elected at the same time every 2 years. But the Senate has a third of their representatives elected every 2 years. And the reason they do that is so that they don't have a brand new crop of a completely different group of people, and then they can make more changes. And so you're going to have to, it's very difficult to get all of the senators to agree to anything, because each of those senators has the ability to filibuster. And that's an important distinction between the House and the Senate. Of course, a filibuster is you talk and talk and talk and don't allow them to hold a vote on an issue. And so in order to break a filibuster, you need to have 60 votes to call the vote. And since it's only 53 to 47, that means that any one senator can actually block a vote from taking place. And that's an important distinction between the two houses. Kupfer?
I was just going to say, I mean, I don't know how long the filibuster is going to be around for.
I was going to add the same thing.
For
That might be a moot point pretty soon.
Yeah, it depends on the outcome of the election. Although I wouldn't be surprised if either party got rid of it at this point. But if the Democrats win the excuse me, the White House and the Senate, I would expect the filibuster to go away. And if the Republicans win the White House and the Senate, I also might expect it to go away. They've already killed it on judges. That's why the new Supreme Court nominee is going to be able to get through without any problem. She's probably only going to get about 53 votes or so, 55, somewhere in that range, depending if one or two Democrats come in. That vote hasn't happened yet, has it? I don't think it happened yet today.
It's happening today, I think.
Happening today. I don't know if it's happened yet today.
Yeah, I've been in meetings for a while, so I don't think it's happened yet. But so I don't know the total vote count, but it'll probably be greater than 50 and lower than 55. My guess is it'll be probably right down the line on a party vote. And so you may have one Republican or two that are in a Senate race right now that are afraid to vote for her for their own election coming up in a week. But anyway, yeah, they already killed it on those. So it's only a matter of time, I think, before the whole thing goes through, which I think is going to be a theme, depending on the outcome of this election, with a lot of what we're going to be talking about over these next 3 days. I would expect to see some reforms on a lot of these institutions and structures, depending on the outcome of the election, of course. But I think that the Democrats think that the system treats them unfairly at this moment in terms of, particularly with the Senate and the court. But I don't want to deviate too far, but I think the filibuster is one of those entities.
Just to piggyback on what both of you said, but Ted, you pointed out the terms of office. Terms of office are important with regards to how that affects representation and how that affects how the institutions operate as well. And since all 435 seats are up for re-election in the House every 2 years, literally the day you're elected into the House of Representatives, you're running for re-election. It's easier to have widespread turnover in the House, right? As you said, all 435 seats are up for re-election every 2 years. You conceivably could put new blood in the House of Representatives and all 435 seats every 2 years. Now, with the incumbency advantage, right, that doesn't happen. But the reason the senators, again, have those longer terms of office, their elections are staggered so that wholesale change of the Senate would take 3 election cycles as opposed to 1. All points to the fact that the Senate was supposed to be a moderating chamber. I always explain to my students, think of the House as rock and roll and think of the Senate as classical music. It's the Senate is wild. The House, I'm sorry, is wild. It's ruckus. You're more apt to have more extreme members who may be farther to the right or farther to the left, because you can win district-wide elections. It's a safe seat, even if you're a bit more radical than the general public, but you more or less got to gravitate to the center statewide election. And so, we keep going back to this. It's a balancing act. It's the genius of the system again, that the Senate kind of exists to moderate, for lack of a better term, the wildness, of the House of Representatives at times.
Yeah. So let me ask you, Special Powers, do you think that's still the case? Do you think it's still classical music, or would you say it's now more like pop music?
I don't know, man. Your guess is as good as mine. Smooth jazz. I don't know.
Oh, gosh. I think the fact that you're seeing what you're seeing today, a Supreme Court nominee getting put through, as there's already been about 61 million people that have voted already that aren't going to have a say on any of this. I think you're already seeing that it's becoming more like the House, and the House is becoming more like the Senate. I would argue, at least.
That's interesting. And it's a good point. You could look at it the other way too. The Senate's always been a bit further removed from people than the House, in a sense, with their longer terms of office and the fact that maybe the Senate isn't being as responsive in this instance as what the general public may want, really kind of in line with what they've done. What would be a really interesting debate is whether or not, the 17th Amendment was a good idea or not. And because originally, as we know, senators were intended to represent interests of states, not necessarily the people from the states.
Right.
But I don't know if we want to go there.
It's an interesting question. I could talk about that all day, actually. But
Yeah.
I think, yeah, as opposed to just having them be appointed again, as opposed to elected.
Just
It's more like the House of Lords than it was, if we're going back to Britain,
Yeah.
the Parliament, the House of Commons, which is more like the House. The Senate was always a little more like the House of Lords, which were kind of noble people that, were just kind of elites, I guess, for lack of a better
Right.
term, that would exercise a certain degree of sobriety and temperance from the passions of the House. And we've gone away from that, I think, in the Senate. To me, I think the bad is I'd rather have the Senate act more like the House than the House of Lords, personally. But
just to clarify for the students, throw in a little bit of history. So in 1913, the United States passed the 17th Amendment, and before they passed that, the Senate was elected by the state legislatures and not by the people. But there was a progressive movement in this country where the people wanted to have more power for themselves. And so one of the reforms that they created was a directly elected Senate. And so, and there's still conservatives today that are like, that was a big mistake. We need to go back to before 1913 and have the state legislatures elect them. I've heard that, actually. It's kind of a funny argument.
Well, I don't know.
Conservatives have this, and it's just a different point of view, have this idea that we should stick to the original intent of the framers. But there is a theory behind it. They borrowed from all sorts of people in designing our system, and one of them was Polybius. And Polybius described the Roman system, and John Adams was a big fan of Polybius and some of the other founding fathers. He thought the genius of the Roman system, Polybius was, that it also created a system, at least before it became an empire, of balanced powers, where the consuls, which would be the equivalent of our president, served as the monarchy. The Senate served to represent the aristocracy, and then the assemblies, the people's assemblies, were representative of democracy. Well, we kind of borrowed that. The House is the most democratic chamber. It was supposed to be directly elected by the people, serve the interests of the common man. But I think the Senate originally, I'm not saying it should still be that way now, but just to explain what they were thinking, the Senate would kind of be an aristocratic body. It would represent the elites of the states. The people would have their voice in the House. The elites of the states would have their voice in the Senate. And then the closest thing we'd have to a monarchy or something, where some power would be concentrated and maybe things could be done, was in the hands of the president. So there's a reason why they set it up that way. And it was, democracy wasn't first and foremost the only reason why they did it. It was to create a balance of interest to represent different sectors of society. But that's kind of archaic, right? So I'm not one of those that would do away with the 17th Amendment, but at least that's the way they were thinking.
Let me ask a question to both of you. I don't mean to act like a moderator, but I'm just curious to know what either of you think about this. Is the number 2 in the Senate, 2 senators for each state, is that antiquated at this point? I believe, I haven't looked it up in a while, there was about almost a little under 4 million people at the time of the Constitutional Convention. And does that number sound about right to you? I think it's about that. California now has a population that's more than 10 times that. Texas is about 7 times that. Florida is about 5 times that. So just when we had in New York too, I mean, that's an interesting question in of itself. How many states have bigger populations than the time of the country when it was founded? I'm guessing it's probably in double digits or close to it. So actually, it definitely isn't in double digits. What am I saying? It definitely is. I mean, the country now is 350 million people almost, or like 340. So I guess the question is, does that need to be proportional to what it was at the time of the founding, if that makes sense?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there as an idea. Or should it still be 2?
Well, all I know is, yeah, part of it's theoretical, part of it's technical. I know Article 5 requires that at the end of the day, whether it's 2 or 50, all states have to have an equal number of seats in the
Right.
Senate. So you wonder if it would make any difference. Does it matter if it's 10 or if it's 2, if at the end of the day it's equal?
Well, if you would have to make it so it's not equal. You would
Right.
basically say that maybe you have 1 senator for like kind of like you do in the House. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but 1 senator for every 10 million people, or maybe an extra senator for every 10 million people, some number like that,
Right.
so that you don't have a situation. Because right now, the way the country is being clustered into cities, you're going to have a situation where it's something like 70% of the people are going to be living under 30% of the senators. And so the reverse, you would obviously have 70% of the Senate only representing 30% of the people. I'll yield on that. I don't think that was the founders' intent.
I mean, no, it wasn't, and that's why and Ted, I'm sorry, I'm gonna give you a chance. I feel like I'm dominating here, but what we're kind of doing is, and your point's a good one. What we're kind of doing is judging the Senate based upon how it's set up, with an eye toward, well, it's not very democratic, but the Senate wasn't set up to be a democratic institution. So it certainly doesn't fit that theory that we might prefer it to be. But it all really is a moot point, because there's only one amendment, only one change we cannot make to the Constitution, and that is to deprive any state of its equal representation in the Senate.
That's true.
So, even a constitutional convention, that's an interesting question too. Could you change that part of the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention when Article 5 specifically says this is the one change to the Constitution you can't make?
Yeah, I don't know if you can.
I don't think you can. Yeah.
I mean, I think that there is a sort of disproportionate power that is experienced by the smaller states in the United States. Those states have a disproportional policy power in this country. And so, if you take North and South Dakota, you take Montana, Nebraska, Kansas, going down through the midsection of the country, they wouldn't make up the same population as California. But yet they have a disproportionate of power in the Electoral College, because the Electoral College, which is what elects the president, they formulate the numbers based on the Senate and the House. And so not only are the smaller states more represented in the Senate, they're also more represented in the presidential vote. And so I like Stephen Powers in the same way as that can't be changed. But one of the things that the Democrats are probably going to look at doing is bringing in more states. Specifically, if they win, Puerto Rico, maybe Guam, maybe
Washington, D.C. would be one.
In Washington, D.C.
Because Washington, D.C. has well over 1 million people, and they have no congressional representation right now.
Right. So,
which again, that raises a constitutional question too. I mean, DC was created, by the Constitution, specifically not to be for fear that would be shown preference by the United States Congress. They're all really interesting questions. It's kind of at the heart of, are we more of a republic? In which case, the way that the Senate is set up doesn't seem so misguided, or should we be more of a democracy, right? In which case, there is disproportionate power. I'd agree with that.
Right. Well, it's also though well, I don't want to get too wrapped up in the politics of it, but I mean, what the majority of the people are going to eventually want. I mean, because whether people are correct or not, I think most people think that we're a democracy and they don't really think of us as a republic. Although I know we are, but you know, some of this gets down to the expectations of the population. And if you want a stable country, you can only deprive the majority of what it wants for so long.
The thing is, majorities change.
Sure,
And
sure.
you know, this is an interesting question too, you know, hashing all this out. And that is that, you know, talking about, well, if the Democrats are elected, or if the Republicans are elected, you know, how do they change all these rules? And that's a little troubling too. You know, one of the things we got to agree upon as a country is that we're all abide by the rules. You know, before the game starts, field goal's worth 3 points. You don't get to change it because you're behind by 4 points at the end of the game and the clock's run out and, you know, you can't get in the end zone. This is kind of concerning. You're right. I don't like how the Republicans push through this nominee. It kind of goes against the spirit of fair play. I don't like how the Democrats got rid of the filibuster to fast track their judges. And, you know,
Reid still says it was a good
out of the
idea.
bottle, everybody's kind of said, well, the rules don't apply to me anymore. If I can't accomplish what I want as it is, you know, I'm free to change the rules. But after, you know, I think at some point we all have to agree what is the playing field we're going to compete on. And, you know, it worries me a bit that, well, you know, I'm not getting what I want because of the playing field, right? The rules need to be changed because my side is not benefiting from them at the moment.
But don't you think that the election is playing by the rules, and then after the election, you do what, I mean, to use your football analogy, what the NFL does, which is they reevaluate the rules after a season to see what needs to be modified, right? All sporting, now sometimes sports, baseball, which I know a little bit, you know, baseball, they'll just start adding, you know, well, that will just make everybody have a DH like they just did, you know? I mean, like, you know, sometimes the rules are silly well, I don't like the DH, but that's a separate discussion. But anyway, I mean, it's you know, I think that's what some would argue is you're in between kind of seasons at that point, and then you're reevaluating. That's the argument. But I agree with your point in that. I mean, I've had arguments or discussions, I should say, with people who are on the Democratic side who are saying, you know, we need to pack the courts. And I always say, if you do that, you got to be comfortable with the Republicans doing it. And then you're just going to end up with 150 people on the court in 20 years. You know, at some point, if the Democrats put 13, you know, make it 13, why would the Republicans not make it 20? And they will eventually have power again, probably sooner than later, the way things work these days. So I agree with your sentiment on that entirely. I mean, everything has to be looked at in a, you know, kind of sober way in that regard. I mean, if the Democrats win the House and the Senate, my guess is some of this will go away because they'll have won. They're just going to be upset because the way the whole court system, the way the judges have worked out the last 5 years.
Your baseball analogy is interesting, you know, given that, you know, most baseball fans are purists and don't like too much change. But no, your point's well taken.
Right.
Yeah.
And just I think the legitimacy of the government is really, people are starting to question the legitimacy of the government, which is extremely problematic. And I think that a lot of the reason that they do that is because the presidential candidates promise the sun, the moon, and the stars, and then Congress comes in and they don't give them what they want. You know, Congress is there to stop legislation. It's not really there to pass legislation. And so the American public hate Congress, but the founding fathers created it, and that it's working. but there's this sort of distrust of government. There's this feeling that they're not coming through on their promises, that you need to have somebody that's going to be bold and efficient and create change. And I worry about the expectations. And I tell sometimes my students, I'm like, just because the presidents are promising all of these things doesn't mean they're going to be able to deliver.
And I agree with that. And on that point, I think some of this comes back to the fact that, perhaps people need another lesson in federalism. A lot of the problem is that politicians are promising that the federal government is going to do things that the federal government was never designed to really do, right? I mean, the federal government is doing things that were really designed for states to be doing. And we've kind of gone away from that to a degree. But again, some of it is just the country is much bigger geographically, it's much bigger population-wise, it's much more diverse. It's just, in a lot of ways, we have I'm not advocating getting rid of the Constitution. I just want to state that before I make my other statement, but we're being governed by a document that is governing a very different population and country than the one we have now in terms of at least of its size and the way it looks. We have states now in 5, 6 time zones, as opposed to just one at the time of the founding. I don't even know if they had time zones. I don't even know when time zones began to exist. That might be a completely ignorant statement. But anyway, I think that's part of the problem, is that the federal government perhaps is doing more of some of the business that the states should be doing. There's good reason for a lot of that, but not always.
I have a question. So as we look at the legislative branch, we know they are the ones that create the laws. But what powers do Congress and the House of Representatives have in regards to laws?
Well, the House has more power than the Senate when it comes to the purse. So, any laws that would affect changes to taxes, revenue bill, what they call revenue bills, have to originate in the House. Everybody's familiar with the fact that and again, remember, the House is considered closest to the people. Everybody remembers that, one of the battle cries of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. Well, that message still ringing in their ears. When they write the Constitution, they wanted to make certain that if financial bills were going to be initiated in Congress, it should start in the chamber that's closest to the people, so that it would, give more weight to its legitimacy, that this wasn't being forced down the people's throat. This was something the people's body was initiating. So that's one big difference between the two. Going back to what Ted said, kind of I guess a little lesson here. Ted, you brought up the issue of political parties, and you really can't discuss the operation of Congress without political parties. It's how they organize themselves for their business. It's through parties they choose their leaders. It's through parties that they choose their committee assignments. And to the extent that this session is as much as kind of a lecture series as a discussion, for anyone that's watching that doesn't know, Congress does always work through committees. And committee assignments are made through the party caucuses, and the party that holds more seats, the majority party, always gets a majority of seats in the committees as well. And it's always a member of the majority party that chairs every committee. So there are efforts through the party system to give a bit more order to what is kind of a chaotic system. Ideally, the majority party should be running the chamber. They should be able to get through whatever they want. They should be able to get through the chamber, whatever they want. Now, I realize there are political considerations that have to be made, but I guess what I'm saying is that the members of Congress have discovered over time how to work within the limitations placed upon it by the Constitution. I just thought I'd add that there. When Ted brought up parties, I thought it's good to remember that political parties are kind of the oil that lubricates the machinery of Congress. It's how otherwise separate members can coordinate their activities and get things done.
It's interesting when Stephen Power, or I keep saying your full name, but when Steve is talking about, what's that?
I said, please do so. I like it.
So when Steve was talking about the committees, the committee chairs have an inordinate amount of power. If you are not in the majority in a committee, which the Republicans do not have a majority in any of the committees, then if they propose a bill in committee, that bill dies. And most bills die. It's interesting. And a lot of bills from the opposition party, they don't even get considered. They're not even brought up to be voted on in committee. They're not debated at all. So a lot of people don't understand that there's these choking points throughout the entire system. And so bills will often die in committee. They'll die on the floor. They'll die in the discussion that takes place between the Senate and the House. Sometimes people will vote for it to get out of committee, but then they'll vote against it on the floor. So it's a very complicated system in which there's a lot of different ways that a bill can die. It's much easier to kill a bill than it is to actually pass it.
Which again, places if you want to look at it positively, places a premium on legislation. And it's something that a lot of people can agree upon that there won't be a lot of opposition to, maybe. But I'm probably thinking idealistically there. So.
Well, I mean, it's true. That's what the founding fathers wanted.
Yeah.
They wanted it to be hard.
Right.
Any other questions or?
I don't see any more coming in. Yeah, I don't see any more coming in, but you all have done a great way of explaining how legislative branch works, and Congress' role and the House's role. I know we'll get questions afterwards, so I know how to contact you all and vice versa. And if they log on tomorrow or Wednesday, they can always ask those questions in reference to today's session. But I want to thank you all again. Do you have any closing words? I know tomorrow and Wednesdays will be great conversation because there's a lot going on that students can relate to and have some input or some insight that they would like to share also. So if you have any closing words, the floor is yours. If not,
I guess just as a prelude to tomorrow, to the executive branch, I'll end where I start. I think it's intended for Congress to be the leading branch of the government, but almost from the start, and it continues through today. The presidency is by far the most powerful of I think the three chambers. So I think it'll be interesting tomorrow to talk about whether or not this is a healthy thing, whether or not the power of the presidency's become too vast, or if perhaps it's not powerful enough, given all the problems we face as a nation and our, sometimes the appearance at least of our inability to deal with them. So I don't know how you guys feel about that, but it's kind of an interesting question.
Definitely interested in the power of the presidency because I feel like it's the branch that has changed the most.
I agree with that, yeah.
But in terms of, I think that there needs to be a certain amount of awe or majesty that we attach to the Constitution. Isn't it amazing that we have people from Mississippi in the same country as somebody from San Francisco, right? I mean, and yet we're all Americans and we're all, able to live under the same system. I mean, you definitely have to recognize the genius of the founding fathers.
Well said.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you all again for joining us. Students will have the trio tomorrow talking about the executive, and then Wednesday talk about judicial. So thank you all again for chiming in, and we'll see you all tomorrow. You all have a good one. Stay safe.